Welcome to NVivo in Action, Introduction to Content Analysis with NVivo 12. I'm your host for today's webinar. My name is Stuart Robertson, and I am an NVivo consultant and trainer. I've been working with NVivo for over 15 years. I came to NVivo during my doctoral work. I used it for both my literature review as well as my dissertation research. I did a single case study focused on the social and cultural forces that come into play in the creation of an alternative educational environment. By using NVivo, you can save time by working more efficiently, quickly organizing and retrieving your data. You can uncover connections that are not easily identified manually and add rigor to your research process. The NVivo suite is comprised of two Windows-based programs, NVivo 12 Pro and NVivo 12 Plus, as well as a native Mac-based version. Finally, there is NVivo for Teams, a server-based add-on for the NVivo 12 Pro and Plus versions. Today's demonstration will be conducted in NVivo 12 Plus. The tools used are available in both NVivo Pro and Plus, and all but one are available in the Mac version as well. Thinking about how NVivo fits into the research process. You start by gathering the data or information with which you need to work. After you import the data into NVivo, you can explore and analyze the data, and then be able to visualize and share your findings, typically leading to a publication of some sort. NVivo supports a wide range of data and information types, from traditional documents and PDFs to audio, video, and images. You can also import survey data via Excel, SurveyMonkey, or Qualtrics. Additionally, data can be imported from social network programs, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, as well as OneNote, Evernote, and Outlook. NVivo can also import files from EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley, and RefWorks. New in NVivo 12, you can import SPSS files directly into Pro and Plus and export materials in the SPSS format from both the Windows and Mac versions. NVivo has powerful tools to help you both analyze and visualize your data from a variety of perspectives to assist in the finding of patterns and trends, as well as sharing your findings with your audience. Some of these tools are particularly useful for those engaged in mixed methods research. In building this webinar, I looked for a definition of content analysis on which to anchor the presentation. I chose this definition from Krippendorf because of its inclusive nature, as well as the recognition that this can go beyond just text-based data, which better reflects the wide range of data with which NVivo can work. Today's webinar is designed to introduce a selection of tools in NVivo which have particular applicability to content analysis. The features of NVivo will include nodes encoding, the word frequency, text search, matrix coding, and cross-tab queries, as well as the framework matrix. The framework matrix is available in the Pro and Plus versions of NVivo 12. Now I will move into the NVivo software. One of the things about NVivo is a lot of research has been put into trying to make it as user-friendly as possible. From the welcome screen, there's a lot of support materials that you can access, from deepening your own knowledge to getting ready to do your research. When you're ready to start a project within NVivo, simply clicking blank project and titling your project. So I'm going to call this content analysis sample. And what NVivo does in the standalone version is it creates a copy of the project on your computer. It is a .nvp file for the Windows Pro and Plus, and a .nvpx for Mac. What's nice about this is because that project file is created, anything that you bring into your project will be stored in that file. Any of the work you do that can be saved within the project will also be stored within that file. It makes it simple to create backups of your current projects. It also makes it simple to create copies of your project that you can then share with perhaps other team members if you're part of a team, so that members of the team can be working on the project at the same time. And when you're ready to do some comparison, NVivo has within Windows the ability to merge as well as within Mac. We do strongly suggest that you stay in team situations in one platform or the other. The workspace for NVivo was modeled after Outlook, so to give it a somewhat common feel to some of the work that you are some of the work that you've probably done outside of NVivo. When you first create a project, there's a screen that comes up for getting started, quick start steps that you have there. So as you're new to NVivo, you've got resources available right from the very start. I'm going to go ahead and close that for right now and come over to the left-hand side of the screen. This area that you see here is the navigation view. This is where you can organize various folders that you might be using. You can organize the materials that you're bringing in to your project, or perhaps queries that you're using. To bring data into your project is really quite simple. Anything that comes in goes into the data section and goes into the files folder. Depending on the size of your project, you can and often will create subfolders to help organize the material that you're working with. For example, I'm going to bring in some sample interviews. I can right-click on my files folder. I'll create a new folder. Refer to it as interviews. And once I've got a place to store my material, I have the ability to go ahead and bring that material in. If I am working in the Windows version, I do have the ability, of course, to use the right-click pop-up menus, and I can import items into my project. If I'm using menus instead, there are ribbons at the top in both Windows and Mac, and I have an import tab, or in Mac I would also have an import menu at the very top of the screen. If I'm going to be bringing in text, documents, text, PDFs, audios, videos, or images, they all come in under Files. And I can browse out to wherever I have those particular pieces stored. I can bring in multiple copies, multiple documents, I should say. And I'll just bring in a handful here. What NVivo does is it creates a copy of those documents and places the copy inside my project file. That way my originals are safely stored outside of my project, and if I accidentally delete something or move things around within the project itself, I'm not going to negatively impact my, my files, original files. In NVivo, I can double-click to open up
the materials that I brought in to NVivo. And in the Windows version, I have a tab structure that allows me to move from active document to active document, or if I've run a query, which we'll talk about in just a couple of moments, I can move between query results and other items within my project. Those of you who are using the Mac format, you, of course, can have multiple items open. The only difference is your list of active items will be in the lower left-hand corner of the workspace. And you'll be able to move between items from there, and also able to close items that you may be done with, just as I can with the X in the tab structure. When I'm looking at content analysis, there are many different approaches that I can take. And NVivo, really, we like to call it methodologically agnostic. Thus meaning that it certainly can function appropriately in a number of different methodological choices, depending on how intimate the researcher wants to be in the process, or sometimes due to time constraints, we may need to jumpstart a little bit of the work we do. For example, if I'm going to start going through and looking at the content here, I'm going to begin to organize the pieces that I find, the patterns, potential patterns that I'm looking for. I'm going to organize them in a node structure. I can create nodes ahead of time if I know that there are particular things of which I am interested. So if I click the nodes section here on the navigation view, I can either right-click and create a new node, or under the Create tab, I can create a node. And I might be interested in how people are talking about and referring to families in a set of data. So I may say family reference or references, and being able to create that node so that when I'm interacting with my data, I can, when I find some text that may refer to it or data that may reflect it in some way, I can highlight and I can drag and drop that right into the node. One of the nice things about the nodes themselves, what NVivo does is it organizes the data you've selected. First and foremost, it will organize it by the source from which it came. So you always know the source where it came from. You have a quick reference as to how many pieces of data you have coded from that particular source. And if you're interested in how much of that source is represented in this coded data, you will have a percentage coverage to get a sense of whether this is covering a large portion of this particular source or a much smaller portion. What NVivo will then do is it will organize the data that you've coded. They will be organized sequentially as they appear in the original source. So that you will have them sequentially when you're reading through. As you code more and more, you can scroll through and be able to see how this topic evolved, both within a given source and across multiple sources. One thing that I, from a research perspective, always appreciated was the fact that NVivo kept me linked to my original source. With one click, I could be back and be able to see that particular piece of data in its full context. And so I felt that that was a very powerful tool from a research perspective, that I was never cut off from my data. As I'm going through, I may also come across topics of interest that emerge from the exchanges that are taking place. And in a case like that, I can create nodes as I go. So, for example, I noticed that she's talking about family, but also in that same piece about the idea of community. One of the things that I can do is I can highlight that data, and in the Windows version, I can drag and drop it over into the node section and be prompted to create a new node. I'm going to call this community. And I have that, I'll now have captured that information inside of my new node. And from this point forward, I could now continue to drag and drop pieces into there. The other thing too, if I have highlighted something in the Mac version, I can go up to the Analyze tab and be able to code that as well. So if I'm not much of a right clicker, although the right click is available, I do have that ability to be able to do that as well. With the idea of nodes, what's nice about this is as my analysis grows, I have the ability to create hierarchical structures. So, for example, if I wanted to see these as two components of community building, I have the ability to allow the structure of my nodes to match my current analytical view of the material. I can merge nodes together. I can code and uncode material. So I have a lot of flexibility in how I'm interacting with that data. There are other tools that can also be helpful to perhaps get to look at your data from a different perspective, or to help you jumpstart the process of coding and working with your data. Under the Explore tab, we have a number of queries. There are two in particular, two lexical queries, the text search query and the word frequency query. These are available in both Pro and Plus. They're also available in Mac. We have text search and word frequency. They will actually be under a tab marked query. If I want to get a sense of what are the words that are being used, I have the word frequency query, which will allow me to quickly generate a list of the most frequently used words. Perhaps I want to look at the top 100 words here. I can look in all of my files and externals. I can choose selected items, so I could choose selected sources that I wanted to look at. Or what I particularly like to mention is that I can also choose nodes. There may be times when you'd like to do a word frequency. What were the most frequently used words around a given concept? And if you've been coding, you can then run a word frequency on a node in order to generate just such a list. I could also look at specific folders. So if I've created multiple folders under my files folder, over in the navigation view, I can focus in on a particular group of sources that I'd like to look at. In this case, I'll display the top 100 words. When I display them, I can either, and this is important for content analysis, I can get a count of exact matches, which means that if I have a word such as develop, developed, developing, I may want to get individual counts because the form of the word that was used may be pertinent to what I'm trying to explore. On the other hand, if I'm looking at more of a conceptual level, I may move this down to stemmed words. And in that case, those three words that I mentioned earlier would all be grouped together, and you would have a count for the entire group. So again, you want to think about what is it that you're trying to pull from this data. In the Windows version, there are, as you can see, 3 additional options that deal with synonyms and breaking down, looking at specializations or generalizations. Those options are not available in the Mac. That being said, I find that for the word frequency, the exact matches in the stemmed words are usually the 2 that are used most frequently. Because of the nature of the counts that are trying to be generated. I'll go ahead and run this query. And what NVivo does in this case, it shows me a list of words that it has organized initially by raw count. Because I asked it to use stemmed words, it's also showing me other words, other forms of the word that were grouped into that particular count. If there are words that I know I do not wish to count or do not need to count, I can add them to a stop words list. You'll notice words like a and the are not on this list. NVivo does create a stop words list to get you started. I can remove words from that stop words list, or I can add them. So, for example, I may not necessarily need a particular name, or there may be words here that aren't necessarily giving me insight. So I can select those words and add them to my stop words list. And then rerun the query to be able to get an updated list to review. There, with the word frequency, we also have a very popular visualization, the word cloud. Oftentimes, this is an excellent way to get a sense of what are your most popular words. If you're more of a visual person, as myself, this is a great way to get into that. It's also an excellent way if I want to be able to invite my audience into learning more about the study that I've done. I do have a number of different options as to how I can present this, depending if I'm going to export it and use it in perhaps a PowerPoint or in perhaps a print document. I can right-click and I can export the word clouds, and there are a number of different options within the gallery. And that is available for both Mac and Windows. In the Windows side, it will be over on the far right. You'll have word cloud. In the Mac version, it will actually be listed right at the bottom of the criteria. Once I've gotten a sense of what might be happening within the content that I'm working, there may be specific terms, specific phrases in which I am interested. And for that, I can turn to another one of our queries, the text search query. The text search query will allow me to locate specific words or phrases. If I want to use phrases, I can certainly use quotation marks. But let's say, for example, that I wanted to use, I noticed that there were a few forms of the word fish, fishing in this particular data, and I want to see how that is playing out within my sources. This is a place where I probably, at the very least, would use stemmed words because I'd like to see how the different forms of that word are being used. For those of you in the Windows version, this is also where I'm more likely to use my synonyms, and in particular, I like specializations, but it's great to explore with a lot of these differences. If I go ahead and I run this query, I can see which sources have this particular word or phrase in them. If I look at the reference view on the far right-hand side, again, on the Mac, it would be right above where the results are. I can start to see the words that were used. I can later, if I wish, spread the coding because one of the great features of NVivo is the fact that when I do something like this, when I run a query like this, I can turn it into a node. So this is an excellent way to jumpstart my focus on particular terms, phrases that might be of interest. One of the tools that I particularly appreciate, especially in thinking about content analysis and looking at some of the pieces, would be the word tree. And the word tree allows me to look at specific forms of the word and be able to see initially the words leading into and coming out of that word. What this does very nicely is it makes me aware of particular words right before or right after my focus word, my root term, that may impact how I need to think about how that word is being used. In this quick example, I may have thought about fishing, but perhaps I hadn't thought about subdividing into perhaps commercial fishing and recreational fishing, both of which are showing here. Because I did use multiple forms of the word, I have the ability to change the root term. In this case, using the specializations, I have other potential words as well that I may be looking at. In the Mac version, your ability to change this word, if you've used stemmed words, there'll actually be a triangle arrow right beneath the word, and you'll be able to drop down the list of potential words right there. Again, I can right-click and I can export this word tree if I want to use it as a visualization, use it in my presentations. I can save the results. This way I can turn the results into a node. So if I wanted to, I could create the results as a new node. Is one option. I could put it in my nodes folder and be able to just call it fishing. I'll just call it fishing for now. I can always change and modify the words later and be able to then add that to my project. So as I said, it's a great way that I can start to jumpstart the creation of nodes. And the ability to create a node from your criteria, from your query is available in both Mac and Windows. The other option, if I come up here, I'm just going to bring back my last run query. I can also add to project, and what that allows me to do is I can actually store this criteria. That way, if I, for example, am bringing in more data later, then I can run the exact same query with the new data. So that if this is something I'm going to use over and over again, there's a repetition in the process, I have the ability to save that as well. One of the other things that I wanted to look at, sometimes we, in looking at conversations, we may want to get a sense of what did people talk about, and does that vary? Sometimes we'll want to look at, does it vary from person to person, or does it vary from group to group? And to start to explore something like that, I just want to introduce the matrix coding query. And to do that, I'm going to close this small project that I had just been working with here. And I'm going to go into the environmental change project, which comes with NVivo. You have it in both Mac and Windows. In this case, beyond just creating nodes for the thematic units, the researchers also created what are called cases. And basically, cases allow you to take your data and create groupings based on your units of observation or your units of analysis. So in this instance, they took and created a case for each of their interview participants, which in turn allowed for the application of attributes. So anybody who was created and classified as a person were given the access to attributes such as the township they lived in, or the age group, their gender, and those types of things. Having that available when appropriate to your study gives you some great flexibility in being able to slice your data in different ways. The matrix coding query allows you to look across different groups, different people, to see if your coding has similarities or differences. For example, there was coding done for the natural environment inside of this particular study. I may be interested to see, do different age groups talk about the natural environment differently? Being able to come up to explore, again in Mac it would be under query, to be able to create a matrix coding query. And be able to think about what is it that I want to look across. Perhaps I want to see if different age groups talk about the environment differently. So let me go ahead and see if I can add some case classifications here. And under age group, I'll choose to include my various age groups. And in this case, for the columns, I want to look at the intersection of the age group and the different facets of the natural environment to see how they are similar or different. In which ones they might have focused on in their discussions based on my coding. When I run the query, I get initially a matrix that will allow me to get a sense of how many references I have from each of my age groups at each of my various topics. I have the ability to add some shading. Again, if I am more of a visual person, this may make me aware of potential patterns or trends within the data. When I create a matrix, I have the ability to have a chart. A chart is also created. in that. And that, I have to say, that one is in the Windows versions only. Although the Mac version can create charts from your nodes, currently it does not automatically generate one with the matrix coding query. I can change what the cells represent. Right now, the cells represent the number of references, which is great because I might want to then be able to see exactly what was said. If I double click on a cell in a matrix, NVivo will open up and show me the number of references, show me the references themselves behind the number. For me, this was key. Ultimately, this was the tool way back with NVivo 2. I've been at this a while, as I said. This was the tool that really pushed me over to choosing to work with NVivo for my research, because I felt I was never separated from my data. And again, with one more click, I'm right back into the original data, the original context. I can change to things such as the number of files coded, row percentage, to see out of all of the data coded across a particular row, what percentage is represented by each of the cells, which can give me some interesting insight into what might be happening in the data. I can export the matrix as an Excel spreadsheet or as an SPSS file, if appropriate. If I want to do some more quantitative work with the output as appropriate, I certainly can do that. In the past, the matrix query also sort of doubled as a crosstabs. But now, in both the Mac and Windows versions, we actually have a crosstab query. So this way, if I want to be able to focus on looking at either crosstab codes against attributes or codes against cases, I can do that. So for example, if I wanted to look at my natural environment codes here, I could go back to my node section and be able to select my natural environment nodes and be able to drag and drop them into that appropriate section. And I could look at them. Perhaps I want to look at it initially by a single attribute. In this case, under person, I may be looking at age group. And I can run that query. And now what NVivo has done is it's shown me the number of in this case, the number of people I have in that age group. It shows me the number of people from that age group, unique individuals who have commented on a particular topic. So I can become very quickly aware, is this something that multiple people within that group talked about, or was it something that was focused on by one or two in particular? And I can see the total unique individuals that I have. And also at the end, I have the counts for each of the rows as well. If I want to add a second attribute, maybe I want to look at age group and then break it down by gender, I can add that second attribute by simply choosing gender and rerunning the query. So now I have a breakdown by age group and then a further breakdown by male and female. In this case, were the genders that were identified. Again, I can right-click and I can export this. I can export it out to Excel. I can export it out to SPSS if I wish. So it's a great way to be able to look at your data and get some insight. One last thing that I'd like to take a look at, and while we're inside of NVivo here, was the framework matrix. And this is available in the Windows version. It's not available in the Mac version. But for those of you who are using the Windows version, I can share this with you. What I found, especially if I'm looking at the content of what's in there, this was an excellent tool to help me organize, create a graphic organizer as I started to think about being able to write about what was happening within my data. For example, I might want to look at how different people in my study talked about facets of the economy. And what Framework Matrix allows me to do, I'll create one here called Thoughts on the Economy. And in my rows, I have to use cases. So I will go into my cases here. I'll use select. And in my cases, I'll go to my people. And for this example, I'm just going to take maybe the first 4 or 5 people here. For my columns, I can choose the nodes that I've been coding to. In particular, I want to, for this example, select the 4 major aspects of the economy. Initially, NVivo will create an empty matrix for me, but what is nice about this is once that matrix is created and I click inside of it, in my menu Framework Matrix tools, I can auto-summarize. And NVivo will take anything that I've coded from that case at that topic and fill the cell with that information, with that data for me. And now I have a chance, if I look across a given row, I can see how one person talked about different facets of the economy. If I look down a particular column, I can see how different people talked about or discussed the same facet of the economy. 2 very nice things about this is because of the structure, within NVivo, I can add my own notes if I wish. One suggestion I do make is that if you do, I find it a good practice to change the font color so that I know what is mine versus what it belongs to my participants. The other thing that I like to point out is that I can right-click and I can export the framework matrix, and I can export it out to an Excel spreadsheet. What's nice about this is if I'd like to get some feedback from colleagues who don't have NVivo, I've got the ability to do just that.
Today's webinar was designed to introduce a selection of tools in NVivo which have particular applicability to content analysis. QSR has a number of resources designed to support their customers, from a welcome video to getting started tutorials, free educational webinars to product-specific help sites, as well as online communities. More about these resources can be found at www.qsrinternational.com/NVivo/customer-success. Thank you for joining me today. I do hope this session was helpful. I wish you the best of luck with the projects that you have undertaken.